Thanks, mate. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you, Output, for giving me a bit of an opportunity to wax lyrical on what is definitely my favorite topic, which is rehab. So there's almost 1,000 people who have signed up to this, which is absolutely mental. So I hope that you find it informative, and it has an influence on your practice as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name's Murdoch, and I'm the owner of Elevate Speed Rehab, where I'm lucky enough to work with a whole bunch of elite level athletes in both performance and in rehab settings. Now, this webinar is going to focus in on my approach to rehab, which I refer to as a speed-based approach, and how utilizing a fast to fit approach in particular can accelerate ACL rehab with your athletes. Now, I've put up the Instagram account there, so if you don't follow me, give it a follow and tag me in any stories that you decide to put up, so that I can try to answer any follow-up questions that people might have. So that would be a good way to do that. Now, I've only got 30 to 40 minutes, so I've chosen a few choice topics to get stuck into, with the overriding objective of highlighting my philosophy and frameworks so that this all makes sense to you. We'll get stuck into the typical elite athlete ACL roadmap and objective measures that are associated with that. And finally, I'll give you some examples and ideas around how you can use Output to enhance that objective criteria approach beyond the typical tests to make really good and informed decisions. And then we'll round it off by summarizing an international level athlete's ACL recovery timeline, tie it all together, and hopefully give you a bit of context. So before we start, I wanted to let you know that this webinar is a prelude to 2 ACL workshops that I'll be hosting in Ireland in conjunction with Output across the weekend of the 10th and the 11th of February in 2024. I'm really excited about this one, as it's not only the first one that I'll have hosted, but it'll really elaborate on a lot of the topics I briefly discussed today. And as a thank you for signing up to this webinar, you'll be receiving a 15% code via email, along with the recording of this, which will be available to the first 25 people that sign up to the workshop. So first up, let me detail what I consider rehab to be, as I think having a definition that influences and drives your approach or systems is really important before we even get going. So rehabilitation to me is a blend of art and science to enhance healing and recovery, mechanical function, biomechanical efficiency, sporting skill, and tolerance to appropriate work that permits an athlete to return to the sport better than when they left. Now, this definition really defines my philosophy as such, and there's a heavy influence from all of the above throughout my entire process. And to me, great rehab is understanding how to take all of this complex information and weave it into a coherent program that complements one another and maximizes the athlete's development, all the while keeping the athlete engaged and constantly learning aligned to their objectives as well as our own as a coach. But the very truest marker of whether I or you as a rehabber have done a good job is that the athlete returns to training and sport confident and in a place to tolerate and excel within the demands of the game at the toughest periods of competition. So that's always my end goal. If an athlete simply makes it back into their environment, but is just existing and not excelling, I've probably not done a good enough job. So on to my non-negotiables of great rehab. And if there's one slide to take away from this entire presentation, this is probably it. And you'd be amazed how far just applying these really, really simple rules will take you when delivering rehab. And the following are my primary rehab non-negotiables that help you make good decisions when it comes to progressions or regressions of specific exercises and sessions within your program. Now, the first one is no pain beyond acceptable levels. Now, pain thresholds definitely come with their own complexities, granted, around the athlete individually. But in summary, if the onset of pain reaches moderate, or I use a 4 out of 10 pain scale, then quite often that comes with an associated inhibition, a deloading, or some kind of change in technique. And for me, that means it's going to be time to regress the exercise. The second is no response, and this refers to the response of the tissue of the injured site. So There's two factors to consider, which is short and long-term response. And response can range from pain and swelling to loss of function and range. And if any of these happen throughout the rehab process, I'll be trying to deduce why and then regress that aggravating stimulus back to the highest point of tolerance. Number three is the physical competency. And this term refers to neuromuscular output, or in other words, force production of the injured versus the uninjured side. And if there's big discrepancies between force output during tasks, then I'll again try and regress that stimulus to the point where it sits within acceptable bandwidth that I'm fairly certain I'm actually training what I'm trying to train. And although it's really difficult to give you exactly what that percentage is, I'll usually cap it at around 30% as a top end limit. Any exercise that showcases a difference bigger than that, I'll usually pull back and regress. And the final one is movement competency. How you move is just as, if not more important than what you move. And the reason for this is that the body is a master problem solver. And more often than not, if a target is set as an outcome, the body will naturally reroute around our weakest points, meaning we don't actually train the appropriate muscles or movements needed to enhance recovery or needed to enhance adaptation. And as such, I've technical models for almost all exercises that I prescribe, from prep-based exercises to sprinting and cutting. And adherence to these models is what I call technical threshold. And accountability to this is it's absolutely critical for longitudinal movement development. And in my opinion, health and performance as well. And it's really common for my athletes to become obsessed with movement rather than the numbers themselves. And that to me epitomizes how much importance that I place on movement competency. And like I said, it's really simple, but if you have these at the forefront of your mind when rehabbing, the job does become a lot easier very quickly. So jumping in a little deeper, these are my core principles that really drive my more intricate decision making and organization of training with my athletes, both in rehab and in performance settings. Now, these core principles are super important when navigating through the often complex rehabilitation process, and they're really there to simplify my decision making and get rid of any noise that may negatively influence what's going on. So, number one is it starts with speed, and understanding the demands of high speed running and locomotion in general allows for us to begin training those qualities in whatever regard as soon as the athlete has got off the operating table. Now, this process is known as reverse engineering and is fundamental in what I refer to as my speed-based approach. So if you understand what the end goal looks like, it becomes far easier to plan the journey to get there. Number two is starting early. So this is kind of tied into the first one, but it recognizes that if strength is king, coordination is the crown. And I think that we are maybe shifted towards being a bit of a force-obsessed industry, particularly in rehab. But it's the how of force production in the right context that actually matters. So I'll do everything in my power to include and develop both morphological and neural qualities that not only allow the expression of force in appropriate tasks, but really give the athlete an opportunity to refine their coordination, skill, and feeling to make later stages more seamless. The third concept is baseline plus one, really important, this one. And this is a system of progression that means that I only add one new stimulus within any session. And this ensures that positive adaptation, or a negative response for that matter, can be attributed to a specific stimulus. It also means real focus and detail can be given to that one specific stimulus, which I've found that makes a huge difference to athlete focus and quality of the session. Number four, and this one people will have heard before, is keep the main thing the main thing. Identify 1 to 2 main priorities on any given day or week and train according to those. Anything that sits outside of those will most likely get removed or rethought. And this is of particular importance for myself because I do easily get overexcited when it comes to rehab. There's so many things that I could do that could be cool. But in the reality, there has to be a bit of a priority system in place to help me make smart decisions consistently to get the best out of the athlete. And the fifth principle is one that I have learned from Dan Path, And that's always have a plan A, B, and C. And this means that you can always train an underpinning physical quality that supports your end goal, regardless of what you have to navigate, whether that be a niggle, lack of equipment, athlete fatigue, mood, change in plan, etc. If you have to cancel a session due to a lack of regressions or planning, then I would consider myself to have failed. And the final one is probably the most important one for me that's influenced how I rehab over the last several years, and that's that movement matters. Understanding movement in key planes and tasks will tell you everything you need to know about an athlete's underpinning qualities, as long as you know where to look, which is what we refer to as coach's eye. Now, unfortunately, I wish I did, but I don't have time to go into coach's eye for high intensity actions today. But this will be a massive focus of the ACL workshop that I deliver in Ireland in the new year. So hopefully I end up seeing a lot of you there and we can get our teeth into it. Okay, so this slide underpins what I call my speed-based approach, and it has a massive influence on pretty much all my systems. And to keep things simple, it's about defining and understanding the demands and the underpinning physical qualities behind what I call the HIAs, or the high intensity actions. Now, to me, these high intensity actions are change of direction and decel, acceleration, and max speed. So understanding these high intensity actions is actually an entire lecture on itself. So I'll briefly take you through what I consider the major qualities aligned to HIA in order to train them more appropriately. So on the left here, if we first consider change of direction and deceleration, we're really talking about the halting of momentum and the redirection of the body through a change in vectors or force vectors. Now, underpinning these abilities, we've got eccentric braking strength and reactivity. So now, not only is it imperative to be eccentrically strong through the chain, and in particular the knee, which is paramount in any ACL rehab, but we also need to acknowledge the influence of joint coupling or coordination of multi-joint flexion and extension across the ankle, the knee, and the hip. So that's something that's really key to efficient deceleration. Basically, can you become good at the task? Lateral hip strength and stability across the pelvis influences the stability of both the stance leg, which equates to more force into the floor, which is usually always a good thing. And it also influences the function of the free leg in order to create more flexion and time to reorganize for the subsequent action that's going to happen. So lateral hip strength and stability is often referred to as hip lock. It goes a little deeper than that, but hip lock is a major part of it. And finally, the role of the pelvis and the relationship with the trunk. And the best movers tend to be the ones who can succinctly dissociate their upper body from their lower body, whilst being able to control the pelvis in all three planes of motion. And that gives them more solutions to movement problems. So this ability, which I refer to as fluidity, is really important here. If we look at acceleration in the middle, we're concerned with qualities that allow the athlete to go forwards in time and space quickly. So from A to B as quick as they can. So maximal strength and rate of force development properties influence hip displacement. So that's something to consider. Pelvic range and function allows the athlete to generate large shapes and snap out of them quickly, which is something we refer to as switching, which is again another key ability. And reactive properties around the ankle, the foot, and the knee permit the efficient transfer of force into the floor with minimal leakage, leading to shorter ground contacts and an ability to recover in time for the subsequent ground contact of the next step. So that would be the underpinning qualities of acceleration I deem to be really important. And in max speed, the primary areas of physical development will be around supporting an ability to produce massive forces vertically into the floor in incredibly short time frames. So system stiffness, which put another way is just high levels of co-contraction and quasi-isometric force, is important here across the posterior chain and the knee extensors. Reactivity and elastic qualities of the entire lower limb are needed to utilize and recycle the energy that's been applied into the floor. And the transfer of energy across the pelvis through efficient postures and a fluid spine permits a better limb exchange, which influences how fast and how hard you can exchange your limbs in preparation for the subsequent cycle or step. So in summary, the abilities that are instrumental in efficient performance are underpinned by physical qualities that we can train if we can A, understand them, and B, identify them. So these concepts form a huge part of my systems, and I'll always refer back to them. And by the time my athletes are done with rehab, they're familiar with them as well. So the next question is, how does this speed-based approach compare to historical approaches? Well, the biggest one is that my speed-based approach aligns itself to what I would call vertical integration. So with a vertically integrated approach, different components of all the different variables seen down the left-hand side of the diagrams will be apparent in the rehab process at once, albeit with varying degrees of focus dependent on the stage of rehab the athlete's in. In the older approach, there would be a linear and chronological approach taken to training with little consideration given to foresight and the early development of skills and motor control. This vertically integrated approach ensures that development of qualities aligned to those high intensity actions I've just mentioned, making the transition through phases far more seamless and permits performance development, not just a tick box exercise of specific physical qualities. So to summarize the comparison, in the old school approach, there would be a period of introductory programming at the commencement of each phase. Whereas in the newer speed-based approach, the coordinations and fundamental physical qualities responsible for their performance are commenced much earlier in the process, albeit at a regressed level. So not only does this give the athlete more time to hone in and develop their skills, but it keeps them engaged in meaningful activities that actually feel like their sport earlier in the process. And that's a massive, massive aspect of my rehab approach. So here's the system, or my ACL system at least, in more detail. So I can't show you all the streams and all the exercises with coaching points and objective assessments and progression points attached to them, but I am going to be able to do that at our weekend workshops being held in Belfast and Dublin in February. So if this sparks your attention, then get signed up and I'll see you there. So if we look at it, down the left, we've got the big components of training and the phases of ACL rehab shaded in green, amber, and red behind that. Within each training component, there's various streams and threads that commence at different times, kind of like what I've just explained with the vertically integrated approach. So if we start at the top left of the system, initially joint function is king. It's really the only thing that matters in ACL rehab if there's been a reconstruction. And from experience, I can't tell you enough. If you don't get that joint extension back within the first couple of weeks, rehab is going to be a really, really tricky process. And additionally, flexion goals are around 10% within 4 weeks, 5% in terms of symmetry within 8 weeks. So the knee is fully functional come return to run time. And to be able to do this, we use streams that are extension, flexion, and early run prep based. So importantly, at the same time, I'll have what I call the forgotten hero stream. So that's one down from joint function on the top left. These are the foot, the calf, the lateral hip or hip lock, and spinal engine threads. Now, developing these in isolation when the athlete can't really do that much because they're either in pain, they're in bed, or they just had the surgery is a hugely important factor to preparing for an early return to feet. And it's something that I think gets missed off quite a lot in the athletes that I see. Below that, we've got our strength and power stream. Now, this stream begins with isolated focus on the quads, the hammies, the groin before narrowing in on a more integrated coordination and function with an eye on key high intensity action shapes, positions, and patterns. So what we've just talked through. Plyos are included halfway through the early phase, so the green shaded phase, and are broken down into jump, land, and bounce. And this is really important because in my speed-based approach, athletes will return to on-feet mechanics far earlier than classic rehab approaches. So preparing the tissues for that stress is a hugely important piece of the puzzle. Below this is our high-intensity mechanics stream. And that's broken down into acceleration, Vmax, and change of direction inclusive of decel. And importantly, all of these can be broken down to in-place and overground work. So this is a massive contributor to improved performance and athlete psyche, in my opinion, from what I've experienced. The feeling of starting that work early has a huge impact on their genuine belief that they can come back better. than they left, and means that when they do change or they do get to change of direction and agility work, we can get struck straight in and not tiptoe our way around some really basic agility squares, lateral shuffles, or agility ladders. In my agility streams, I break down work into closed and open, and in mid-stage, which respects the attentional reserve of an athlete and their capacity for skill acquisition and learning. Again, something we'll cover in depth in the workshop in Ireland. And I'll do that before progressing to our create space, take space continuum, which essentially is athlete-led, or I certainly encourage it to be athlete-led, which is positional specific invasion and evasion work. And finally, my fast to fit stream right down at the bottom there. Here it begins with what I call mini drills, which I'll detail shortly, and how output can provide massive value here, before progressing through to my 10-30 protocol, tempo conditioning, and finally my game sim work, which is essentially the real fitness component of the continuum. So you can see that it starts off with speed and finishes with fitness, so fast to fit continuum. So that's my system for rehabbing ACLs. It's slightly different than the norm, places movement at the foreground and biases the early introduction of speed-orientated training. The result is regularly having pro athletes ready for high performance return to training, better than when they left at around about the 6 to 7 month mark. So hopefully that provides you some context. Okay, so before we go any further, here's the details of the Elevate ACL Rehab workshop being held in Ireland on both Saturday, the 10th of January at Ulster Rugby in Belfast and Sunday, the 11th at Blackrock College in Dublin. The day is going to run from 9:30 until 4, and the focus will be heavily on applied practice and how to build and implement a speed-based approach to rehab, as well as developing your coach's eye, designing drills that encourage learning and training transfer, and also some really novel ways in which we can begin to use the output sports unit in our objective decision-making for ACL rehab to make better and smarter decisions. So it's set to be an awesome day. So please, if you do want to come along, use the 15% code on this slide when you sign up. And the first 25 signups will receive the discount, and then it'll jump back to full price. So grab it. Okay, so we've covered the system in terms of the ACL system from a more zoomed out approach. And now I wanted to take you through my fast to fit continuum because it can be very easily, and has been in the past, misinterpreted for just sprinting your athletes early, which is not the case and is also something that I don't recommend you try with your athletes. So up the top here, we've got an estimation of top speed, and down the side where each modality sits roughly within the duration of rehab. Then if you focus on the colors of text, there's 3 colors, and these colors refer to your conditioning profile. Black text is content that everyone will do, regardless of your conditioning profile. And again, this isn't something that I've got time to go into today, but it is something we'll talk about at the workshop. And blue is for your more diesel type athletes, and red is for your faster, more Ferrari type athletes. So if we have a look at the details of it, during early stages, everybody will undergo my 10-30 protocol. So this is 10 reps of 30 meters of progressive dribble runs. And I'll use the timing gates and I'll use the GPS, and we'll review each and every rep to ensure progressive exposure to intensity, and most importantly, maximize learning to the best of our ability. So lots of review, lots of footage review, lots of video analysis. And if we need to take time in between reps, we'll do that, because efficiency to me early in the process is king, and this gives me that opportunity to do that. So this is the foundations to good running, as it places a really heavy emphasis on postures, patterns, and progressive development of elastic endurance, and things all athletes need regardless of profile, and is something that has become a staple in not only my ACL rehabs, but basically just all my rehabs. We'll then progress on to extensive dribble conditioning. Now, this is the same thing, but longer. Now, this time we've got to focus on developing that elastic endurance I just mentioned, and we'll look at using some constraints in there if people break down technically. And at roughly the same time, acceleration will be dripped in using resistance. So slower usually means less joint-based or elastic stress, with the added bonus that heavy sleds are a great way to develop physical qualities whilst refining technique. So to me, that's a win-win. So again, another massive staple of my rehab process. And depending on who you are, next up, you'll either be completing longer interval MAS running or extensive tempos whilst developing max effort accels and repeat accels in the same kind of time frame. At around the mid to late stage, we're into intensive tempos kicking around the 70 to 75% speed mark, or short interval mass work around the 60 to 65% mark. And here, varied accels and decels in the form of curve running, multilinear and reactive accels will all be included, as will game sim scenarios of progressive durations and densities relative to the athlete's job. And again, something we can't really go into too much detail on now, but that's incredibly important, understanding what the athlete's job actually is. And finally, for the Ferraris, those athletes will be moving into the realms of repeat speed, maintaining 90% plus on repeat effort bouts, as their paycheck more than likely revolves around the ability to express high threshold outputs regularly. So once we're there and the loads accumulated match that of the training loads that they're going to go back to for return to training, then they can return to training. And there's a lot of nuance here that, again, I don't have time to get into, but getting to this stage is actually fairly simple, but managing players through the return to training loads and introduction to match play can be really quite treacherous. And again, that's something that we'll discuss in the workshop in February to get some clarity on how we create systems to be able to navigate that that kind of period of carnage in my experience. Okay. So this slide then kind of segues us onto our timelines and our objective measures, and this is what every S&C and medical practitioner likes, good old-fashioned numbers. So I'm going to break this slide down into two parts because it is a bit of a beast. So on the left here, we've got our ACL roadmap with the phases and the general themes and objectives within each phase. So before every ACL rehab, whether that's pre-surgery or post-surgery, I'll sit down with an athlete and go through this with them, so they have a crystal clear picture of where we are, what's the general content, and what are the criteria we're trying to move towards. And as always, highlight to them that this is a sketched roadmap in pencil and is definitely not anything engraved in stone, which is really, really important to remember, because as practitioners and athletes, I think it can be really common to get caught up in these type of things. And it really is a roadmap. We can deviate slightly. It doesn't have to stick to plan all the time. So plan and pencil. Okay. So stage one is acute. So usually about 0 to 2 weeks in duration. And the name of the game is just about keeping the wound clean, restoring knee function, in particular extension, minimizing pain so they can actually engage in the process, which is a major thing, and drip feeding in early conditioning via our Forgotten Heroes framework of the ankle, the foot, the hip, and the trunk. And we may even squeeze in a bit of contralateral loading here if pain permits, but this is optional. So next up, we've got our early phase one. So early phase one is all about continuing with regaining full joint function, introducing motor control in the form of my Prep with Purpose framework, which is something that will be heavily discussed at the Ireland workshop in February, because I actually think it's the most important thing in the entire ACL process, and gradually progressing capacity. So objective markers that I value here are full knee extension within 10% symmetry of knee flexion, quad and calf girth at around under 20%, but bear in mind this is going to be heavily dependent on what you did pre-injury and how long it took to get surgery. I tend to work with people who get injured and very quickly get surgery, which means that atrophy isn't as big a deal as if you got injured and then there was a long time to wait until you got surgery. And calf and hamstring capacity is measured via calf raise and hamstring bridge. So pretty simple stuff, nothing too mind-blowing. In early phase two is all about regaining cross-sectional area and introducing low-level plyos and speed mechanics to set things up for a really productive mid-phase. So commonly, I think people think the plyos and speed mechanics inclusion is just about exposing the tissue to stress, but it's also about the coordination and learning of reflexes and postures that will set the athlete up for a really valuable and transformative mid phase. It's basically learning the alphabet so that we can then write stories in the mid phase. That's how I explain it to my athletes. Lots of hypertrophy work, including occlusion, electrical stimulation work, isolated quad strength, which I'll objectively assess using output, introductory plyo work in the form of offloaded jump and land content, and a whole host of isometric work to develop neural drive and peak force happens here. And the objective measures at the end of this stage that I like to see athletes move towards are under 20% limb symmetry index of a 10 rep max knee extensor capacity using output as a measurement tool. And that's a 10 rep max comparative to the non-injured side. 20% limb symmetry index for single leg CMJ and a 9 centimeter drop jump. Why 9 centimeters, you ask? It's because the size of my weight plates is 9 centimeters. And 20% limb symmetry index for ISO tests. And for the ISO tests that a lot of people on this call will be familiar with, I think, I'll be looking at the ankle, the knee, and the hip. So again, if people want questions, we can talk about that. So moving on to the mid phase. Now, this is my absolute favorite phase where you can just go to town on technical work and get really creative. And it's at this phase that the phrase movement matters is just rife in the rehab process. We get obsessed with movement quality. So here, my big focus is on strength work as measured through some type of unilateral lifting, such as leg extension, leg press, single leg squat, kind of dependent on what the athlete can tolerate, dependent on graft, etc. Elastic or reactive abilities in the form of intensive plyo content, and a massive focus on locomotive efficiency via our speed mechanics drills and fast to fit continuum. So key objectives here before moving on to late stage is really nailing down strength markers at around 15% limb symmetry index on a comparative 5 rep max leg extension or something else that's suitable. 15% for CMJ and drop jump performance, and the drop jump will have moved up to 20 centimeters by this time. 20% for reactive broad jump, which I'll talk to you about shortly, and 15% limb symmetry index for isometric data around the ankle, the knee, and the hip. So those tests stay consistent. And they're embedded as training tools and testing tools as well. So in the late stage, we're all about speed, all about repeat speed, positional specific fitness, and confidence in specific scenarios, usually with a heavy emphasis on evasive and invasive situations. And in conjunction with these higher force, shorter time domain tasks, objective data revolves around reducing limb symmetry index to under 10% in the anterior chain, isometric tests and plyo variables, as well as minimizing and, where possible, surpassing previous best data for speed kinematics, which I measure as project, switch, and react scores, which again is something we'll deep dive at the workshop in February. And that type of information is incredibly valuable, and your coach's eye plays a huge part in this late stage. So we'll get into that in great detail. And finally, this last stage of return to training is simply about tolerance to the demands of training, be that sessional, daily, or weekly, and the development of tactical clarity whilst refining key skills that will allow the athlete to return to full training better than when they left. So for this, I'll heavily rely on GPS to guide me when it comes to tolerance of total load and intensity density variables relative to worst game scenarios, if I can get hold of those pieces of information. So again, that's a real whistle stop tour of an entire ACL process and criteria. But within that, there are several exercises and drills that I like to objectify and connect with the athlete on to drive intent and absolutely make sure I'm making the right decision in the right moment. Okay, so talking about those data-driven decision-making moments, this slide really is about how I use the output unit outside of the usual measures of just jump height and RSI metrics. So in any rehab, regardless of which one, there are certain big mountains that the athlete will have to climb to move on to the next stage. So in ACL rehab, I see there as being 3 big mountains, and I use the output to help guide me over those mountains. Now, the first is return to loading and subsequent movement. So without a functioning knee and a direction of travel for improving an athlete's individual movement and mobility limitations, rehab can become a cycle of load, negative response, deload, do it again, and that's something that you don't want or need. Now, I'll use the output unit's mobility measure to really help me in this regard. I'll track general knee flexion and extension daily or weekly and use the holistic mobility function to assess limitations and differences to help me direct my mobility interventions, which play a massive part in the rehab process as well. So as Dan Paff would say, a distorted pulley will fray any rope. And this is something that I'm really diligent about within my rehab process, particularly because I do use this speed-based approach where people will be moving with more intensity sooner than perhaps other approaches. So the quality of joint health and movement is really, really important for me here. The next big mountain clearly is return to running. The athlete will place a lot of value on this moment. Knee function, anterior chain strength, and the RSI generated in lower amplitude speed drills will help me decide whether an athlete is ready to make that step to return to on-feet conditioning. So I'll talk you through that in a sec. And finally, return to agility. So here, knee extensor strength plays a massive part, as well as reactive qualities of the entire limb. So I use output to ascertain whether the athlete is in a position to tolerate the demands of live evasion using quad strength testing and vertical and horizontal reactive measures, such as drop jumps and reactive broad jumps. So we'll now take a look at how I use the sensor in the real world, instead of me just telling you theoretically. So one of my staples within all types of training that I use is what I call my compass protocol. So here I like to use the sensor on mobility mode and take a look at various movements that are pertinent to where I want to take the athlete. So in particular, that's a focus on internal and external rotation and flexion and extension of the hip. Now, the reason why these are important is their role in an efficient gait cycle, with limitations in any of these variables commonly resulting in compensations in gait. So given my heavy focus on early phase locomotion, this is something that needs to be identified and dealt with early in the process to streamline the athlete's experience of a speed-based approach. So once this has been done, I'll give the athlete mobility and therapy homework to help accelerate any changes we make here based on the information that the compass protocol provides. So the next one is a massively important one, and that's the leg extension, which is a proxy for knee extensor strength. And that's a pivotal quality in ensuring knee stability during activity. Now, what I do is use the leg extension strength pathway setting to measure angular velocity, which is the speed at which the athlete can move the leg through range. So it gives me two pieces of information. One, how quickly can they extend their knee with a relevant load? And two, how much range can they actually generate from injured to non-injured limb? Now, depending on the phase, whether that's early phase 2, mid stage, or late stage, I'll find a 10, 5, or 3 RM on the healthy side and make angular velocity comparisons on the same weight with the injured limb. So the objective will be to meet the objective criteria that we've just spoken about, giving both myself and the athlete clear and definable goals within each session or phase. Now, and I find this really interesting. Of note is the similarities in those symmetry scores when using a 3 RM loading scheme to the gold standard ISO-K data taken at 60 degrees per second, which is commonly used as an objective marker and checkpoint for return to run or agility in ACL rehab. So from my experience, there are extremely close links between that 3 RM leg extension peak angular velocity and ISO-K peak torque and work done asymmetries. So therefore, it would suggest that this particular test might actually be a great alternative to the far more expensive and harder to access ISO-K testing that has long been used as an end stage marker for ACL rehab. So fuel for thought on that one, I guess. Okay, the next example has played a crucial part within my ACL rehab systems over the last couple of years, And that's the ability to objectify and analyze an athlete's reactive properties during low amplitude drills. So for me, low amplitude drills are low amplitude and small dribbles and scissors. So usually this type of information would really only have been made available using expensive biomechanical tech. But now I can assess and check an athlete's ground and air times comparatively between limbs before making a judgment as to progress outside, tie the laces up, and begin entry into my faster fit pathway. So by using the sprint drills exercise, I can look at air contact ratios, so similar to an RSI and a drop jump, to begin to understand whether I've got homeostasis limb to limb within my drills. And like I mentioned, I like to see knee extensor symmetry at 10 RM loading on the leg extension and drill RSIs, many drill RSIs here under 20% before I open the doors to on-feet conditioning. And this is again based on my early non-negotiables, which are physical output and technical threshold. Yep. Okay, so another staple in the mini drill series that I'll regularly pop an output unit onto is a box reflex. So there's two starting positions here, which are number one, floating heel, so feet side by side, and number two, the A-frame where your leg is up in a kind of sprint position. So floating heel is a regression due to the lesser drop height, and A-frame is a progression. And for this one, I tend to look at a couple of things that are really important. So the first is pretty obvious. I want to know that the athlete has a degree of symmetry in terms of contact time when completing the task that essentially represents technical upright running. I'll look at contact time, but there's also another really cool variable that I'll keep an eye on, and that's peak acceleration, which is measured in Gs. Now, the reason that's important is because it's really common for an athlete who's undergone ACL surgery to have a lot of inhibition when they're looking to strike the ground during various exercises. So it's the brain's way of putting the limiters on to try and protect a compromised joint. And the other reason it's important is that the knee has a sneaky habit of remaining what I call inhibitively stiff, meaning that it doesn't want to bend on ground contact and expose the joint or the tissues to high peak flexion moments. And the result is often a short ground contact. So understanding ground contact and acceleration allows me further to understand, does the athlete A, want to hit the floor, and B, have the elastic qualities to get back off quickly if they do want to hit the floor. So an athlete shows me a symmetry of 10% at level 1, so the floating heel, and within 20% in the A-frame during these drills, and that's in conjunction with the other metrics that I've described. I'll progress them onto my 10-30 protocol for session 1 of the Faster Fit framework, and then it's a case of progressing them on through there. So I really hope that makes sense. And the final exercise or drill I wanted to share with you is linked to progressing an athlete to live agility. Now, being able to do or not do this exercise does not guarantee by any means that the athlete, their knee is prepared or not prepared for the demands of live agility. But it does give me and the athlete confidence that the knee can tolerate, one, high levels of force in short time frames, two, generate adequate levels of pre-tension, and three, tolerate high levels of braking force upon landing. So what I look at is the contact time of the first contact and the distance the athlete was able to jump. And if you divide the jump distance in centimeters by the contact time in milliseconds, you get an RSI score. And it's symmetry in that I'm looking at in conjunction with how the athlete generated their score. So video analysis here is really, really important. And the goals are to obtain a symmetry of around 20% limb symmetry index during mid-phase, where we'll commence change of direction work. And I like to see that reduced down below 10% by the time an athlete is in or exiting late stage where they're being exposed to live evasion. And additional benefits are the opportunity to observe landing mechanics during this drill, which will also act as a good opportunity to coach and develop qualities associated with really aggressive braking strategies on that single leg land. So that's 5 ways in which I use the output unit to make even more informed decisions within my rehab process. And they've really proven invaluable to me over the last couple of years. And I hope that they will provide you value as well when if you decide to use them. So the final thing I wanted to share with you, and I've kind of gone a bit longer than I expected here, is an elite athlete ACL rehab timeline using a speed-based approach. Now, I'll leave you to scan over this slide to digest the content and what was done when. But as a summary, the blue section is the introduction of important gym-based activity, and the yellow zone is where we introduce movement patterns, exercises, and on-feet drills, and running relevant to on-field performance. So as an overview, week 0 to 2, like I mentioned, are about healing and reducing pain. And at this stage, we can also look to influence joint range of motion through a variety of passive and active flexion extension mobility drills. And additionally, isolated capacity, motor control, and strength development was commenced in the form of foot, lateral, hip, and trunk work. At week 6, the athlete was undergoing various full range, where possible, loading activities in a range of bilateral and unilateral stances. So these were your classic squat, hinge, lunge, bridge, step-up variations. And at this stage, in-place mechanics and hip lock variations were heavily present to prepare the athlete for introduction to on-feet work at week 10. At week 10, low-amplitude plyometrics were introduced alongside introductory mini-speed drills that we've just looked at. Lateral movement was introduced in the form of lateral sled drags and shuffles. And by week 12, K-box was brought in to target eccentric deficits, open chain leg extension, and more intensive plyometric drills in the form of low box drop jumps. Concurrently, acceleration work via loaded sleds, low distance acceleration decelerations, closed chain of direction skill, and on-feet conditioning in the form of the 10-30 protocol was commenced. And by month 4, we'd introduced more aggressive plyos with depth jumps, hops, repeat jump capacity in the form of the 10-5 test. On field, things were really beginning to ramp up with the inclusion of dribble bleeds and wickets, curvilinear acceleration and reactive decels, and more intensive conditioning via extensive and progressively intensive conditioning. Additionally, sport-specific drills were given time across the week also at this stage. And by week 20, the athlete was sprinting, attaining PB velocities, change of direction had transitioned to live ovation in chaotic and specific scenarios, and contact was introduced at low levels to introduce the athlete to that particular stress, but not so much as to overwhelm other priorities with excessive fatigue. At week 22, we introduced game sim and tried to replicate the training week demands progressively across 2 weeks before he was integrated back into training at week 24. So there we go, a whistle-stop tour of my speed-based approach to ACL rehab. I really hope this final slide gives some context to what I spoke about in this presentation, because there was quite a lot of theory. As always, it's really tough to try and convey your entire philosophy and approach in 40-45 minutes. And this is why I'm really excited to be running these one-day workshops in Ireland on the 10th and the 11th to give people who are interested in upskilling in this area a chance to spend the day discussing, developing, and exploring this approach, and give you something that you can take away and really use to streamline your athletes' rehabs and have them back better than ever. So with that, we're done. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully I'll be seeing you in Ireland on the 10th or the 11th of February. So thank you so much for listening in. We are going to take a few questions. So I guess we can open up the floor to the questions if we've got any, Brian, can we?
Yeah, we have a few questions, Al. I know you have a hard stop now in a couple of minutes, so we probably won't get through them all. But just a few of them scrolling down here. Okay.
I'm just going to stop this share, mate.
No problem. One's here, Alan, you briefly touched on conditioning buckets for athletes. Could you please expand on that and how that affects your programming?
For sure. Right. So this is based, well, actually, originally it was based on, I used to be a rehab coach in a professional rugby setting, and we had a framework of conditioning, and it was the same framework. And depending on your injury, you went through X, Y, and Z progressions of conditioning. And what I started to realize was some people would absolutely excel at certain types of conditioning, and another person would be absolutely terrible at it. And then give them a different stimulus, and it would be completely the opposite. So what I used to do was I actually based it around, okay, well, what is somebody's top speed? And generally, what do they tell me that they enjoy doing as a conditioning stimulus? So what you'll find is the really fast blokes, the twitchy blokes, will tell you that you're absolutely mental if you think you're going to get them running 2 and 5Ks. Whereas if you have I call them diesels, but the guys that can truck all day and they can just keep going, and they tell you that they like a bit of everything, and they don't really, if you ask them to sprint repeatedly, they're dust. But they can go at slower speeds constantly all day long, like a bit more of an aerobic athlete profile. From this, I started categorizing my guys as Ferraris or diesels. And I would then slide them into the different streams of conditioning. So if you're a Ferrari, your conditioning profile would be more velocity based. And if you were a diesel, your conditioning profile would be slightly longer, slower, and more aerobic orientated. And there's some great work out there from other people in the field who really specialize in this area. Gareth Sanford springs to mind. They've done some great work at England cricket as well. So if you're interested in really going into the detail of understanding how to profile, it's usually based on max speed and 2K time trial to generate a score or a ratio. And based on your ratio, you're more appropriate to do different types of conditioning. So I do it verbally based on what the athlete likes and looking at them and understanding how they play the game. And having a conversation, and some people do it far more scientifically by actual rigorous thorough testing. So hopefully that helps.
I'm just conscious time here, Al. Can you take another question or two? Or yeah. Somebody wants to know here, what is the 10-30 protocol you refer to?
Good question. Okay, so imagine 30 meters. I wish I had a whiteboard. 30 meters, 0 to 30. So 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. I'll break down my 30-meter zone or my 30-meter distance into 3 zones. Technical posture. You spend 10 meters trying to encourage the right postures that you'll have done in your prep with purpose work inside in the gym. The next phase is, okay, well, can we build the velocity of that by slightly orientating forward and slightly hitting the ground a bit harder, but still maintain the same postures? And then in the final zone, it's gradually over sessions building up to a velocity that you can tolerate, that you don't have any response, don't have any pain, your technical threshold is good, and your physical output is good in terms of your displacement, your air time, your contact time, that kind of stuff. And we'll kilogram it up and we'll educate the athlete on really efficient running mechanics. And over time, we'll see the scores or the velocities that an athlete is doing or completing through that 10-30 protocol will gradually increase until we get to the point of about 60 to 70% velocity, and then we'll move on. And that 30 meters is repeated 10 times, so 10 by 30, and that's the 10-30 protocol. And it's just a really rich coaching, learning environment for the athlete from a movement efficiency point of view, but also is a really nice way of ensuring gradual stress that the athlete is exposed to.
Brilliant. And maybe just last one, if you have a chance, it's is there anything that would be drastically different in other lower limb injuries?
Yeah, for sure. So the actual overall system in terms of taking people from positional isolated to integrated level strength that's associated to completing high intensity actions, and then pushing them through a faster fit continuum is fairly the same. There's some discrepancies there around, in particular, around groin and soleus injury rehab, because they respond ever so slightly to different running modalities. But the biggest thing happens in the strength program. If all your focus is on hamstring and knee for an ACL, if you've got a calf or a syndesmosis or something that's not based around the knee, then your strength program is very much going to focus in and around that particular joint. And the supplementary work is going to be working up and down the chain of that joint to try and give the athlete the best opportunity possible to create stability and force output in that limb. But in general, the streams and the methodologies are fairly similar across all lower limb injuries, yes. Perfect. I've got time for I can go until 7, mate, so I've got another couple minutes.
Okay, perfect. you might have touched on this already, but on the last slide you referred to the number of weeks, and it goes, I assume this is from Ben. I assume it's referring to a specific athlete. Would you normally progress based on an athlete meeting certain criteria? Within the context of last slide, what criteria are you looking at to progress?
Sorry, mate. Is that written down?
Yeah, that's just in the chat. If you just one of the last questions in the chat.
On that last slide, you refer to weeks. I assume it's referring to a specific athlete. Would you normally progress based on athlete meeting criteria within the context of the last slide? What criteria are you looking to add to progress? Yeah, for sure. So yes, that was weeks in terms of when things were added in and stimulus was added in. It's always based on criteria. It's never based on weeks. The weeks and the timelines are pretty irrelevant. We're all humans. We have somewhat the same biology. There will be similarities. Some people will adapt really quickly. Some people will adapt slow. Some types of injuries require more time, but it's all based on criteria. And if athletes can meet the criteria that I've mentioned in the slides previously, then we'll move on. But it's not just about criteria. It's also about understanding the athlete and having a really clear picture in your coach's eye and understanding what movement aberrations are happening and why, and targeting those as well. So for example, if I have an athlete that's done their ACL and it's just a clean ACL reconstruction, all good, but they've also done their Achilles, or they maybe have dislocated their hip previously, those combination of factors change the criteria. So if I said that you've got to hit 10% in a drop jump from 20 centimeters, but you've done your Achilles, you've ruptured your Achilles and you've ruptured your ACL, which is not an uncommon scenario for several athletes, saying to them that we are not going to progress anything until we get to 10% probably means that they never ever progress past that point and never play the game again. So it's always got to be taken with a pinch of salt, and it always has to be in adherence to understanding the bigger picture of the athlete's situation. And then the other thing I would add to that is that objective information is brilliant, but your coach's eye about how they generated the objective measures to meet your criteria is more important, because very good athletes have got a very good way of rerouting and finding solutions, maybe not the efficient way. So coach's eye is incredibly important.
Just another couple of questions here if you have time. They're in the chat if you want to address any of them, or I can read them out.
Is your ladder of exposure with exercise selection the same? We've answered that one. What is the earliest you would allow an athlete to return to full competition? Lots of evidence of 9 to 12. Do you base many of gym? Yep, cool. So I will base it off. I definitely won't base it off time. If I'm dealing with youth athletes who've got their whole life in front of them, then yes, it's a conversation regarding the information around the percentage increased likelihood of re-rupture or injury following or for every month that you come back before 9 months. That's certainly a consideration. In the elite population, it's really about, okay, can you tolerate the demands of all the high intensity actions? Are you strong? Are you fit? Can you showcase a tolerance over 4 to 6 weeks of training load demand? So that's relative to the training demand at their club, maybe even at international level, if that's the level of the athlete we're dealing with. Because what often happens is they look like a superhero for 4 or 5 days because they've been with me or they've been rehabbing. It's a really nice environment. They get everything they want. All their fatigue management has been tailored and tweaked to the point where they feel great and fresh. But if there's still discrepancies in their movement profile, for example, in acceleration, if they still are 18% down on hip displacement on their injured side, which is common, you know that they're going to pick that stress up somewhere else. Something else is going to compensate. So I want to be sure that they can tolerate a long-term period of time training at their club, followed by a deload before they worry about going into gameplay. So for the elite populations, it's less time orientated and it's more around tolerance to what they've actually got to do. And they've got to prove that to some degree. And then that changes again if you've got to get somebody fit for a World Cup final. Well, then you maybe don't need to prove anything, and you've got to be sure that they're reactive, they're strong, They can sprint, they can tolerate at least the running demands of a game, and then you've got to make a decision. I've never been in that situation in terms of that level of pressure, but that would be something that you would have to consider in that scenario too. Okay. Louise. Hello, mate. Good question. After this January cohort, the mentorship will be readily available to just sign up and buy on the spot. There will be no more group cohorts. This is the last group cohort. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I think that's it.
Super. Mark Brady just had a question there, but if we have to dash, it's dash.
Yeah. What is it?
It's around assessing hip extension range on all fours and flexion and standing.
Yep. Is it down the bottom?
Oh, it is. Sorry, yeah, it's just down near the bottom. It said, I noticed you assess hip extension range on all fours and flexion and standing. Why do you do it this way? And what way have you found you can nudge the range of motion quickly if restricted?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Honestly, it's easier. It's just easy doing it like that. I can strap the motion sensor on them or the output sensor on them, flip them over on their hands and knees, look at what they've got from a kneeling position. The standing one is really easy purely because it allows me to help them understand the role of the stance leg in driving hip flexion, so the congruence around the pelvis, and that's a teaching tool. But on the flip side of using the sensor, what I actually do is just go through my dynamic warm-up. So my dynamic warm-up is the same every single time, and it lasts about 2.5 to 3 minutes. And within the dynamic warm-up, I'll actually assess an athlete's movement competency and start to understand external, internal rotation, flexion, extension. They're usually postural drills or dynamics that are more associated to actual movement mechanics that we would see in high intensity action. So it has a bit more relevance. I don't put the sensor on for that. I just use my coach's eye, and it's a really nice opportunity to understand if somebody's movement patterns and movement signature has changed dramatically from day one to day two. That's always something in the back of my mind. If I've sprinted somebody and the next day we turn up and they've lost all form of hip extension and their internal rotation is gone completely, I have got some red flags in the back of my head. And I don't know that unless I do my dynamic warm-up. What do you include in your dynamic warm-up? Oh, God. We do window wipers, back rolls with a split, back rolls with a figure four, so straight leg and external rotation. We do internal rotation drops. What else do we do? We do hip drops on all fours. We do hip extensions on all fours, so supine. We then do, prone. Then we do supine tabletop extensions with one leg coming up, which is far harder because you're supporting your entire body weight. We then do lateral flexions. What else do we do? Then we move into our banded distraction work. And to make change based on the things that we've seen, I'll then use a whole bunch of banded mobility and therapy tools to try and make acute change. And then I'll use a bunch of my prep with purpose tools and framework to drive longitudinal change. That's an important thing. So address it, see it, notice it, try and make acute change with your banded mobility, distractions, voodoo bands, therapy. Sometimes I have a therapist doing my thing or doing their thing, and then make longitudinal change by taking them through the prep with purpose framework, which will be aligned to the content of the day. So it could be acceleration, deceleration day, max speed day, might be a change of direction day, whatever. And I'll be looking to make long-term change that way. And the results are really good. Hopefully that helps and answers your question.
Super. Some people are asking for your workshops out, so we put them in there so people can sign up directly. And we'll be sending those links and the discount code out after as well with the recording of the event.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you everybody for signing up and watching this live, and if you're watching it afterwards, thank you so much. It's the support and the intrigue is much appreciated. So thank you.